Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special Gundagai Lamb webinar today. My name is Michelle Henry and I am Supply Chain Manager at Gundagai Lamb. I will be facilitating the webinar today. While people continue to trickle into the webinar, we're going to play you a video explainer that is going to show you all about what GLQ5 Plus lambs are about at Gundagai Lamb and also about Gundagai Lamb in general.
The journey starts with on-farm practices. All Gundagai lambs are raised following Meat Standards Australia pathways, ensuring the highest animal welfare and management standards are met. We accept all breeds commonly found in Australia and encourage our producers to select the best genetics in their chosen breeds, guided by feedback and data. All our lambs are born and raised in open pastures until weaning, when our producers match the best available nutrition for their lambs to ensure optimal animal health, happiness and productivity. This can vary by season and include native and improved pastures, grazing crops and access to grain. Our lambs are raised without added hormones and have never been treated with antibiotics. In Gundagai, each lamb is health checked and producers provided with detailed individual feedback for continuous flock improvement. Lean meat yield is measured using DEXA technology to ensure lambs do not have excess fat, minimising wastage to maximise product use. State-of-the-art MEQ probe technology measures the marbling of each lamb to ensure delicious eating quality every time. The outcome is GLQ5+, an exceptional eating experience, rich and mouth-watering cuts of marbled lamb, guaranteed to be of the highest quality, setting a new world standard for lamb.
Hopefully you are all able to learn a bit more about what Gundagai lamb is all about and what makes a GLQ5 plus lamb. Now we've had a few more people join us. We're going to kick things off. So as many of you would be aware, Will Barton was unable to make it to LambEx 2 weeks ago in Adelaide, but we didn't want anyone to miss out on hearing the Gundagai lamb story. So today, Will is going to present to you all his LambEx presentation entitled A Different Road to Gundagai, How a Family Meat Processing Company Changed Direction and is Using Innovation and Technology to Appraise Lamb and Differentiate Quality for their customers. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off with Will. So today, Will's presentation will go for between 10 and 15 minutes. After his presentation, we'll move into a Q&A session for the remainder of the time. I just ask that if you have any questions, please just have a look down at the bottom of your screen and you will see that there's a Q&A box down there. If you can click on that and type in any questions that you may have, and I'm sure you will have lots of burning questions for Gundagai lamb, especially after seeing Will's presentation, pop them in there. You can put them in against your name or you can remain anonymous if you choose to do so. So now I have the pleasure of being able to introduce you to Will Barton, who's the CEO of Gundagai Meat Processors. Gundagai Meat Processors was founded in 1974 by the Barton family and forms part of the Barton Group brand, which has a long-standing association with the town of Gundagai dating back to 1874. Since joining GMP as their CEO in 2014, Will has led a multi-million-dollar facility expansion project and secured Tier 2 export certification. He is passionate about shaping the future of the industry and in 2021 led the Barton family's establishment of Gundagai Lamb, a new and exciting lamb brand backed by the family's 100 plus years of meat industry experience. Gundagai Lamb will revolutionise the lamb supply chain into the future with innovative approaches to the producer-processor relationship. Will lives in Gundagai with his wife Carla and their 3 children. So I'm going to hand it over to Will now.
Thanks, Michelle. And hopefully if I can drive this adequately, we'll be off and running. I guess firstly, my apologies to the LambEx committee and all the delegates out there for not being able to join you in person for the conference a couple of weeks ago. Also, my thanks for their assistance in getting the word out about today's webinar. And you've just seen the Gundagai Lamb GLQ5 Plus explainer video. Today I'm going to tell our story from a slightly different angle, and like Michelle said, about 10 or 15 minutes of sort of me presenting and hopefully getting to some interesting questions. So the first kind of, I guess, angle that we're going to attack is the way that we operate with complete transparency. Then we'll talk a little bit about what the feedback journey has been like, what it used to look like, what it looks like now, and what we're hoping it will look like into the future, and then what it's taught us and where it's taking us. Then I want to run you through a bit of an example about what the consumer sees versus what the consumer gets, and then talk to how GLQ5 Plus is objectively different. So when I started in this role about 10 years ago, I used to get a lot of calls from producers that went broadly like this. My lambs are amazing. They're better than everyone else's. None of the processors recognise how good they are. I'm going to start my own lamb brand. I'll process 10 a fortnight and take them to the markets in the city. And I think in my experience, that's a fairly common kind of sentiment, or certainly it was, that I used to hear from producers who were frustrated by, I guess, the concept of growing something and then waving goodbye to it and hearing nothing else. So Gundagai Lamb was in part established as a response to that sentiment. And we said, we'll measure your lambs. We'll tell you how they compare to everyone else's. We'll pay you more when they're better. You don't need to start your own lamb brand. We'll process thousands a week and send them around the world to be marketed globally. And so because of this different road, we start with complete transparency. Our grid pricing is publicly available on our website. We pay a bonus of 80 cents per kilo for lambs which meet our quality criteria. And there's also a calculator for the GLQ score on our website. We have the most advanced individual carcass feedback in industry. So we measure hot standard carcass weight, which is common across industry. We also measure lean meat yield by a DEXA X-ray. We measure intramuscular fat or marbling by the MEQ probe, and we look for and measure up to 20 animal health conditions or carcass defects. And so we also then support that by feedback and analysis for continuous improvement on farm. And so because we can objectively measure a range of these traits, and we're happy to share that data with our producers on an individual carcass basis, we've been able to take our producers on something of a journey in terms of feedback. To demonstrate this, we've pulled together some data from 3,000 lambs that were processed in March this year. And this graph here shows you how we used to view them, and I guess how the rest of the industry still does view them. So the only reliable feedback or data capture was weight. And you can see a range of weights in this 3,000 lambs all along a single line from 18 kilos at the bottom to 40 kilos at the top. And I guess there's an argument to say, well, we can see a little bit more than weight. We can probably see fat score, but fat score is, I guess, notoriously unreliable or lacks in accuracy. And so really, from a trade point of view, we're really only trading on weight in the past. The next slide shows the same 3,000 lambs, but with the benefit of DEXA lean meat yield, which you'll see along the x-axis, and MEQ probe intramuscular fat, which you'll see up the y-axis. And so you can see a much richer picture of these same 3,000 lambs. The higher marbling lambs are at the top of the screen, and the higher yielding lambs are to the right of the screen. And then if we go a step further on the next slide and overlay weight categories and any animal health issues that we detected, you get a much richer picture once again. And lambs in our target weight range are depicted in pink. Lighter lambs are depicted in orange. Heavy lambs are in black, and animals with animal health conditions which have been detected are in green. So higher quality lambs to the top, lower quality lambs to the bottom, and then fat to the left and lean to the right. Then if we overlay our GLQ score grading system, we see that lambs with optimal yield, superior marbling, and a clean bill of animal health make it into GLQ5 Plus and receive an 80 cent per kilo bonus. So The number of lambs which make the GLQ5 plus grade varies by producer, and from week to week it obviously changes with different lambs coming through. In this example, 44% of lambs received the GLQ5 plus bonus of 80 cents per kilo. The other thing I should note is that the GLQ score is actually a reasonably complex algorithm. This is perhaps an oversimplification of it by saying it's just high marbling and high lean meat yield. There's a bit more to it, but for the purposes of demonstration, this does a pretty good job. So that's producer feedback in the past, producer feedback in the present, which is that screen there that I'm showing you, which is what every producer gets today here at Gundagai Meat Processors and Gundagai Lamb. And really, by way of recap, we can say that we've always had hot standard carcass weight. We've added in the last sort of 2 to 3 years here, or 3 to 4 years here, lean meat yield, intramuscular fat, animal health reporting, a traceability platform, and an eye muscle area camera. And as far as the future goes, we're now looking at how to measure the impact of soil and plant health on animal health as a way of potentially describing human health benefits. We're interested in whether we can introduce a better maturity measurement than the existing teeth-based system, what options might exist for shear force measurement to bolster eating quality assessments, and the profitability of our producers per CO2 equivalent emitted per DSE. So there's, notwithstanding the fact that we've done quite a bit, there's still a long way to go as we see it in terms of innovation in feedback and improvement in quality and the offering for the consumer. And so when we think about what this has taught us and where it's taking us, one key learning has been the importance of MSA pathways. And I understand you heard a bit about this, or a lot about this at LambEx. The introduction of MSA sheep meat pathways in 2007 provided standards in sort of 3 main categories. So on-farm management, pre-slaughter handling, and processing. And the adoption and commercialisation of objective measurement technology in our plant at Gundagai is really proving what years of research and over 400,000 consumer taste tests has been telling us. And one example of this dynamic is the importance of minimum daily weight gain pre-slaughter. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, for a lamb to be MSA eligible, it needs to have met minimum daily weight gain requirements for the 2 weeks leading up to slaughter. And this is a very specific example that we're taking you through, but it's a really important one. And you can see on the screen there that there's 100 gram per day minimum daily weight gain for crossbred and composite lambs, and there's a slightly higher 150 gram per day weight gain requirement for merinos. And historically, we wouldn't really have had any way of knowing whether a lamb that didn't quite meet that requirement was impacted at all. But the next slide, an example I'm going to take you through, shows you how we're now able to detect or prove the impact that something like that, or not meeting a requirement like that, might have on eating quality. So this is an example of one producer who sent us lambs in January this year. And keep in mind, this is really only possible when you have a relationship in the supply chain that's built on trust and transparency to sort of unpick what this example demonstrated to us. This is a violin plot. For those of you that aren't a huge nerd like me and don't get into this stuff regularly, essentially, the wider that pink image, the more lambs in that area. So this producer sent us a mob of lambs early in January this year, and they performed really well. You can see that the widest area there is around 4.8% IMF, and 64% of this mob of lambs achieved the GLQ5 plus bonus of 80 cents a kilo. Now, later that same month, the same producer sent us the next draft of those lambs, exactly the same group. They only had an average IMF of 3.5%, and just 10% of the mob achieved the GLQ5 plus bonus of 80 cents. Same breed, same feed, same average weight, but there was clearly something going on that we, I guess, couldn't see. We spent most of that afternoon checking to see if we had a tech issue. Did we do all our calibration steps on plant properly that morning? Was there something we'd missed? And essentially trying to do everything we could to make sure that we hadn't, done something that had, I guess, influenced the result. We eventually called the producer to explain the result, and obviously they would be disappointed because the first mob had got 64% of the mob had got the GLQ5 plus bonus, and so their expectations were set around that. And after a day or two of sort of back and forth, it turned out that the lambs had developed quite a high worm burden between the first and second consignments. Their growth had been impacted, and the results were easily detected on plant by that reduction in marbling. And so you can see that then over the next 3 months, the lambs came through. They sent more consignments each month, and the lambs did improve slightly over the season. But the big worm impact that they had, and a lot of producers in our region had this worm impact in January and February, it was particularly challenging. Really knocked them around. So by the time they got to the end of the season, they were achieving much higher GLQ scores. But this is something that in any other supply chain, you wouldn't really see the impact on eating quality play out if you didn't have the measurement devices in place. And this is just one really good example of what we've learned over the journey and what we continue to learn across a range of different things that we measure. So where's it taking us? It doesn't matter where you are now, data and feedback can help you improve. As the old saying goes, and it's a fairly well worn out example, if you can measure it, you can improve it, and we are measuring every single carcass. So the scale of the data is now helping us build a brand which will deliver reduced volatility and therefore sustainability to our producers. I'm just going to take a little bit of a left turn now, and I'll have to ask you to persevere with me because it looks a little bit off topic. But I want to take you through a little example involving avocados and a story about what the customer sees versus what they get. So in this example, what the customer sees is avocados for $1.80 each at retail. But what the customer gets is some that are overripe, some that are too green, and some that are just right. So how many people aren't buying avocados because of this dynamic, because of this risk? Well, we know from consumer research that 4 out of the top 5 barriers to purchasing avocados are related to product variability, whether that be quality or ripeness. 85% of respondents said that they're often too expensive, which is not particularly relevant in this example. But the next top 4 results were they turn brown too quickly, they're too perishable, they're rarely available at the ripeness level that we want, and the quality is too inconsistent. And I'm sure that many of you can relate to this example, or at least the disappointment of coming home and peeling a banana that turns out to be too green or too ripe. But what if there were a group of devices available that allowed the avocado industry to objectively measure each avocado and grade them to the consumer? What if those same measurements could be fed back to the grower to facilitate continuous improvement in on-farm practices? I'm guessing consumers would be over the moon. They'd be able to get exactly what they wanted. If they wanted something that was a bit overripe for guacamole or something else, they'd be able to access it. If they wanted something that they weren't going to use for a couple of days, but for the weekend for a salad, they could buy something which was too green. And if they wanted something for that night, they could buy exactly what they needed. Sales would no doubt increase as a result, but it could be quite disruptive because what would we do with any excess avocados that were too green or too ripe? Presumably the industry could better manage both the product and the consumer expectations with this measurement in place. It's all food for thought, but I probably should take you back to lamb and objective measurement. So we will head back in that direction. So what does our consumer see, our lamb consumer see? They see lamb cutlets for $38 a kilo. But what do they get? They get some that have low marbling and therefore lower eating quality. They get some that are too fat, and they get some that are just right. But how many people aren't eating lamb because of this dynamic? And how many people only try lamb once and don't come back to it because of this dynamic? Well, in the USA, Australia's largest export market for lamb, surveys suggest that only 40% of people have tried lamb and just 10% eat lamb regularly, which is defined as once a month. So you can see that if we're able to meet the customer's expectations and give them a product that's just right, then the likelihood that more people will consume lamb or eat lamb and more people will be return purchasers of lamb becomes greater. And so what does the GLQ5 Plus consumer get? Well, they get a lamb product which is all hits and no misses. The only lamb in the world objectively graded for exceptional eating quality every time. Producers get more with an 80 cent per kilo bonus, and consumers want more because of the consistently high eating quality. And so to sort of wrap it up before we get into some Q&A, how is GLQ5 Plus objectively different? Well, major processors say that this can't be done. But we've been doing it for over 3 years now. And I guess in that sense, we're achieving the impossible. Gundagai lamb is already doing what others say can't be done. We're the only lamb brand in the world to objectively grade lambs based on marbling, yield, and animal health. And that delivers an exceptional eating experience backed by over 400,000 consumer taste tests. There's no luck, it's just science. So Gundagai lamb uses the latest technology to achieve delicious consistency in every single bite. Thanks for listening, guys. I think we're going to jump into some questions, perhaps.
Thank you, Will. That was fantastic. And I can definitely relate to the avocado story, being a consumer that is affected by varying quality myself. So I think a really good way to look at what other industries are experiencing too. So now we're going to move on to some questions. So if you'd like to pop any of your questions that you may have into the Q&A box at the bottom, that would be fantastic. But Will, we've had some questions that have also been sent through to us prior to today. So our first one is, given that other processors say that IMF is too slow to measure, how is GMP actually achieving it?
I think there's probably a few ways to answer this, but essentially our lamb floor chain operates at sort of between 9 and 10 lambs a minute, which is by no means the slickest in industry. I think, some of the faster chains are probably pushing 14s and 15s. But the way that I guess think about it is that the probe that we use is the MEQ probe, and it's effectively takes one chain space and one labour unit. So like a lot of things, our lamb floor maybe 15 years ago operated at say 6 lambs a minute. Now it's going 10. To get from 6 to 10, over the last few years, we've duplicated some of the roles in the line. So maybe at 6 lambs a minute, we only had sort of one person open up the forelegs when they were prepping the carcass, and now we have 2. So I would say that there's no end to the speed at which it can operate. I don't know how fast a single operator can go. Certainly faster than 9 or 10, because our single operator has time up their sleeve. But I suggest there's a point where you'd have to duplicate the task, and I think the bit of a challenge that you get then is, what's the cost benefit? So if you've got 2 labour units and 2 probes to keep up with your higher productivity rate, then commercially as a process, you need to make a decision about the value of that information being captured to both your producers and to your end customer.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Will. We've had quite a few questions come through, so we'll start to work through those now. So we've had one around, has the proportion of lamb supplied to GMP that meet GLQ5 Plus changed since you introduced it? And if so, by how much?
Great question. So yes, it has. And I don't know precisely how much. I think one of the things that makes it difficult to tell is because we're scaling quickly. So in our first year, we've been doing this for 3 years. We're currently in our third, what I would call full year. There was kind of like a pilot or a trial year at the start. Because the volume that we've processed has just about doubled, we're still getting a high proportion of new producers that are coming into the business. And so when you get someone that comes in for the first time, they don't really know how their lambs are going to perform. So essentially what you find is that producers there's two ways to improve the proportion of GLQ 5+ lambs in the supply chain. I'm hoping this is answering the question. One is for producers that send us lambs that have low GLQ scores not coming back, so farmers self-selecting out, and GLQ 5+, or farmers that are successful with GLQ 5+ lambs coming back more often because of the bonus, and we do find that. So we find high return rates in existing producers. So that's one way that we're improving. And then the other one is obviously genetics and genetic selection, which is a much slower burn because it's generational and it takes years. So we are improving. The rate at which we're improving is slightly masked by the high number of new producers coming in all the time and trying us for the first time who might have low GLQ scores because they've not got the information before.
Fantastic.
That makes sense.
We'll switch into a bit of a breed question. We've had a few on these, and I think if we had $1 every time someone asked us about breed, that'd be great. But this one is around, are you seeing any difference in intramuscular fat results between breeds and in particular shedding breeds?
So I'll be boring and go back to my kind of default line, which is in our first year when people said, what's the best breed? We used to say, we don't know. And then in the second year, people would say, what's the best breed? And we'd say, there's no such thing. And then I think now what we say is, what's the best breed? Well, it's the breed that matches your enterprise, your land system, your climate, the one that's best suited to your production system. And then once you've decided on breed, go in search of the best genetics available. So I think accuracy of the genetics that sit behind the rams that you're buying is really important. So pick a breed that suits you first, the one you like looking at the most, and then go in search of the best example, because we know that there's more variation within breeds than there is between breeds. So it's a breed. There are some breed nuances that we can unpack and maybe build in later questions, but the fundamental point is that there's a lot of variation within breeds, and it's really about the genetics you're picking or the genetic lines. There was a part 2 there about shedders as well, Michelle.
Are there differences between breeds, and in particular, what results are we seeing for shedders?
Well, I think the shedders are probably more likely to have had selection pressure on growth, and that often comes at the expense of intramuscular fat. So it's like anything. So our grid doesn't discount any breed, but before we take a consignment of any breed, whether it's a merino or a composite or a crossbred lamb, or it doesn't matter what it is, a shedder, we would first be seeking to understand what genetics that producer's using. And we would also tread carefully. So we wouldn't take 600, we wouldn't take 6 decks of lambs first up from a producer in any breed without first understanding how their lambs performed, because there's a risk, I guess, for the producer that they send a big consignment and they're disappointed by their GLQ score performance, but also our sales team would be disappointed if we bought a lot of lambs that didn't have many GLQ 5+ lambs in the mix. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. We've got one going back to basics. So can you just explain, how does marbling equal eating quality?
So there's lots of traits, obviously, that impact eating quality. And there's probably a lot of ways to answer this as well. Mostly, I guess the early research from MSA was done in beef, and they realised that marbling had a high level of correlation to eating quality. In lamb, it's no different, but you really need to make sure those pathways are followed. So there's certain building blocks that just fundamentally must be met. So you need lambs to have been doing well enough to have glycogen reserves so that things like pH decline is managed. But all things being equal, that 400,000 consumer taste tests tell us that a lamb with higher IMF is going to have better market acceptance than a lamb with lower intramuscular fat. It's not the be all and the end all, but it is it is the largest leading indicator that we can actually measure commercially, individual by individual, to predict eating quality. So in the perfect world, you'd be measuring probably another 10 traits that all contributed as well, but it's certainly the largest single influence on eating quality that we have the ability to measure.
Yeah, great. Had so many great questions come through. We'll try and answer as many as we can. Another one, have we had any producers stop supplying us as a result of lower GLQ scores or lack of confidence in the measurement?
Not so much lack of confidence in the measurement, because it's been through a fairly rigorous OSMED accreditation process. So that's not something that's led anyone to say, oh, I'm not consigning anymore because I don't trust the device. That's a fairly independent process. Certainly there's been plenty of people that stop sending us lambs because they don't have a lot of GLQ scores. So, and there's sort of a few categories. We've had people that have sent lambs through that are 2% of the mob are GLQ 5+. And so they're obviously not particularly motivated to come back, but we're not particularly motivated to buy lambs from them either, to be quite candid, because it's not the article that we're looking for. And I guess there's always the risk on the first consignment that because we, broadly speaking, we set our base grid to be 20 cents under market. Market's a difficult thing to define at times, but we attempt to be slightly under market. And so that lambs that come through that don't have the GLQ bonus probably would get paid more in other supply chains. But lambs that do attract the GLQ 5+ bonus are more valuable here than they are anywhere else. And so that's typically how we try to manage, I guess, the approach to pricing. And certainly there's been some producers that have sent us lambs that have been disappointed that they've got a very low proportion of GLQ 5+ lambs, and so they haven't come back. And then I guess there's another category of producer who has been producing a very specific article for a long period of time that they can probably guess is going to have low IMF, and they're just sending us the minimum consignment size of 150 lambs once or twice a season and slowly selecting genetics to get better and just coming back every now and again with a test mob. And we have quite a few of them locally that have got a fair bit of scale and are just dripping the odd mob into us just to see if their genetic choices and their nutritional choices are making a difference in their lambs. So, yeah.
Fantastic. We've had a couple of questions come through around sheep EID. So are we currently supplying sheep EID feedback to producers? And what impact, if any, do you see mandatory sheep EID will have on feedback to producers?
So how do I answer this? Our EID, we can provide that feedback, but it's at this stage it's still on request. So the way that EID works in this plant, we've got an RFID system which individually tracks all of carcasses and what most people call hook tracking, and that runs here in the high 99% success rates. It's our whole plant actually depends on the sortation, automated carcass sortation in our chillers, all relies on that functioning. So if for any reason we can't pick up the RFID for the purposes of inputting the IMF or the lean meat yield or the animal health data, then producers are paid default payments, which we obviously want to make sure are accurate, not by just saying we didn't get the data and we paid a default. So we have very low numbers of, I guess, misses in that. The question of EID is a little bit different because when we read an RFID on a hook or we do our hook tracking, the reader and the hook are within a sort of a centimetre or two of each other. So we get like near perfect read rates, high 99%. But with the EID, we're still working through some stuff with electrical noise and other things because the panel readers typically set up on a slaughter floor that's got a lot of electrical stuff going on, and the ear and the tag can not always line up perfectly with it. So it's something that we're working on. If we have a producer that sends us a consignment that says it's really important to me that I get these individually, we just go in with a wand and it's quite a simple process to do. Although I can't quite see if they're staring at me. There's Claire. shooting me daggers, because it does require you to go in. It's a bit fiddly. The question about what was the second half about EID on farm, or what? How
So
we
what benefits do you see that could give to a producer?
Well, I think at the moment when you get our individual feedback, you can tell if, say, a producer that had 100 lambs consigned to us, if 5 of them had arthritis, and you know all of the other things about that lamb. So they also had a weight of this, a lean meat yield of this, an intramuscular fat of that, and any other animal health issues. I guess if you could then tie it back to which animal was on farm, then you might have some data attached to it on farm weight data. So you might have noticed that it was growing slower than the others because it was arthritic, and perhaps it was battling that condition and that impacting its weight gain. And I guess the other thing is veterinary intervention. So if you've, for some reason drenched some and not others, or vaccinated some and not others, and I can't think of a reason why you would do one and not all, but there might be other insights that you can gain out of it. Certainly, I think the growth rate and the importance of those MSA pathways pieces, if you were weighing your lambs and drafting off top, say, every 2 weeks, and you had a data file that said how they were doing in terms of weight, that would be an interesting insight to get on the farm. And I guess as the data becomes richer and we can pick up the importance of various data points, then having an EID file on farm that you can match to it will be, I imagine, of enormous benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Benefits there, I think, for producers. There's a couple of questions around maturity in lambs. So do we see a difference between sucker lambs and lambs nearing hoggets, or sort of older lambs for GLQ5 plus score?
Yep. So a lot of these things are probably better answered by the likes of Dr. Pete McGilchrist and people that were speaking at LambEx and have more knowledge of this than I do. But the lived experience essentially is that as maturity increases, so as the lamb becomes more mature, the likelihood is that they'll have more IMF. That is not to say that we haven't seen some amazing sucker lambs that have had really high IMF outcomes. And so there's a real piece around, because we're so focused on the outcome, there's a real piece that you can, I guess, track that says, notwithstanding the fact that there's a higher likelihood of all sorts of things, there are always outliers. So, like, one good example of that is maturity. So we don't see merinos, for instance. Typically, there are some exceptions to this rule, but we don't buy all kinds of merinos. We buy a meat merino, but they sort of appear from the 10 months of age onwards. Now, they're more likely to have a higher IMF for 2 reasons. One, because they've got a bit more age on them and they don't reach slaughter weight until they're a bit more mature, they're closer to maturity. And the other is that they've really been, historically, the selection pressure has been on things that aren't lean meat yield, which is antagonistic to intramuscular fat. So that increases the likelihood, but it doesn't mean that there aren't some really terrible 11-month-old merinos with small eye muscle areas that just don't perform on our grid. And so, horses for courses. There are some, second cross lambs that will appear in our plant that have hit slaughter weights quite early and are quite immature, that have like no IMF, but there are others that have great IMF. And it's one of the things that we've had to be a little bit disciplined about, as you know, over the journey, to make sure that we're always buying suckers, because even though the likelihood is less that a sucker will have IMF, there are still some amazing sucker lambs there that have great levels of IMF, and we need to be finding those and promoting those for industry. And it's the same shedders and composites, and it's the same of crossbred lambs and merinos. Any breed you can imagine, there are likelihoods that they'll be one way or another, and then there are the objective outcomes that we focus on and try to promote more of the things that we're encouraging.
So while we're on factors that do affect IMF, can you just maybe touch on nutrition? There's just been a question around grass-fed versus grain-fed.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing in that area.
So I think, again, it's I guess grain makes it easier to deliver a certain amount of energy, sort of in a prescribed fashion, whereas there's a lot of variability in grass. But really, it doesn't. Grass and grain aren't particularly um, relevant in the sense that they need optimized nutrition to be growing, um, I guess, at an optimal level. So if you can do that on a grazing crop, and we see some amazing examples of that, of really great GLQ score results with the right genetics off a grazing crop at certain times of the year, then more power to you. If you can do that with, really, really great gutsy kind of improved pastures, that's amazing as well. A lot of people need to or choose to supplement with grain, and so it's really we're not focused on grass or grain because we think that they're really easy things to market, grain fed, grass fed, and it's something that a consumer can understand really quickly. We're less interested in specifying the feed type. We're more interested in saying, if your lamb makes GLQ5 plus, then it must have had its nutritional needs met, because it means that it had a certain level of intramuscular fat and it was growing at a certain rate that meant it was happy and healthy. So the outcome really tells us whether or not the nutrition worked, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a few animal health questions as well. So can you just speak to how animal health affects our GLQ score? What do we actually do in relation to animal health and our GLQ score?
Sure. So the part of the algorithm is a check to see whether any animal health conditions were picked up, and there's kind of two buckets of animal health. There's like a health issue, so things like worms, bladder worms or liver fluke or other conditions, and then there are what we call a carcass defect, which is things like cracked ribs, dog bites, other things that are impacting the carcass. And so anything that is manageable on farm attracts a discount in the GLQ score and makes it nearly impossible to be a GLQ5 plus. But anything that's not manageable, it's still fed back, but it's not discounted. So to give you an example of that, nephritis is a condition that's picked up in kidneys. There's no known management intervention on farm, or no real good knowledge of how to prevent that. So it doesn't impact the GLQ score. But if you had cracked ribs, for instance, that's typically an animal handling issue in either on farm or in transport, or something like something that you can vaccinate against or drench against. Then we would apply the discounting system. Yeah.
Yeah. A really great question here. Do you see a day where there is standard expected practice for your suppliers to mitigate the health effect as seen in the supplier that had a worm burden?
That's a very good question. The obvious answer is yes, but I guess it depends in what sense. I imagine as it becomes more and more apparent with our feedback systems, when there's been a challenge. So, and worms is one example, but there are a lot of examples of I guess, ideal or unideal outcomes that can happen on farm. But I think that producers will end up, in our supply chain at least, knowing that whether they know it's a worm burden or not, whether it was just a weather event or a change in feed that led to a check in the growth pattern, they will get to learn that if they're not genuinely MSA eligible, as in they haven't been consistently putting on weight for that period pre-slaughter, they will self-elect to go to a supply chain where nobody can see that. And let's face it, 99.5% of the supply chain still can't see the things that we see. So there's a lot of options for producers to send animals to that don't have the same criteria as us. The difference in this plant is that it'll be detected most likely. The outcome of that event on farm will be detected, and the lambs will, I guess, be paid differently accordingly. Yeah, or won't achieve the bonus is probably the better way to put
it. There's a question here around whether Gundagai lamb needs ionophore-free production systems.
I It's not
around, I guess, around antibiotics and
look, definitely yes. So antibiotic free is something that we're, I guess, focused on, and I think the problem with antibiotic use is mostly when it's sort of blanket used. So if you're using, you know, feedlot buffers and that sort of stuff that are just a blanket on everything, I think the industry's kind of, or certainly as far as we can see, there's probably better ways to do that now. So Gundagai lamb is an antibiotic-free supply chain, so that probably answers the question.
yes, yeah. Moving on to some really fantastic sales side questions. So being in our third year of selling GLQ5 plus lamb globally and domestically, and on the back of the high eating quality, are sales increasing quickly for your business?
Look, they are. I'm pretty impatient when it comes to sales. So the sales growth is quite dramatic from a standing start. I think the challenge for lamb generally is that it doesn't matter what lamb you're selling. Typically, when you're selling lamb, you're not necessarily going into supply chain saying eat my lamb. You actually start with eat lamb. So a lot of, like, if you think about the American example, our biggest market, only 40% of the population has tried lamb and just 10% eat it regularly. So if you go to a restaurateur, the first thing you're trying to, I guess, convince them of or sell to them is the fact that they should always have a lamb cut on their menu. So they might have, 6 or 8 beef dishes. They might have 1 or 2 fish. There could be a pork there. But the step number 1 is lamb, before you even get to the fact that you want them to eat Gundagai lamb and the importance of grading it into a premium quality product. So we find ourselves in supply chains where, or with distributors who have a familiar relationship with lamb, understand how to cook it, or who are, been on the beef journey, which sort of started and finished 20 years ago, then their understanding is pretty quick and they jump on it really quickly. And then in other parts of the market, it's more of a sort of a slow burn. I think the other thing so there's 2 other points I'd make on that. Australia has done an exceptionally good job, as has sort of New Zealand, for the last 40 years, of just telling everybody that everything we create is amazing and there's no variability in product quality and everything's okay and it'll all eat the same and beautifully. But I liken it, as I did in my presentation, to saying that every avocado sitting on a supermarket shelf today is perfect. We just know that they're not. And so because of that background, there's a bit of unpicking to do there to say, well, there's good and there's not so good, or there's a level of quality that exists everywhere and there's a level of kind of execution from Australia, but there is some stuff that's much better and we can sell that to you and we can separate it for you when we do. And I guess that becomes a bit of a challenge to unwind that behaviour. And obviously price is an important thing as well. Yeah.
All right. So there's another question here just around how much of Gundagai lamb is exported versus available domestically?
Look, it varies. So the majority is exported, but we do have big markets in Sydney, Melbourne. I think we're about to get a fire alarm test, Michelle. That's
we are, yeah. Great timing.
Element to add to our webinar. So domestic. So we've got really good following domestically at food service. There's a couple of little sort of retail options that we're trying out at the moment, but the majority is exported and is at food service. We can buy it in a local butcher shop now that we started about a week ago. We started a little program with them so that our producers could access the product, the graded product themselves at Smart's Butchery in Gundagai, but it's in a Victor Churchill in Sydney and a few sort of select outlets, but it's not widely available in Australian retail. Yeah, I should say you can get it at DJ's in the David Jones food court under a Vic's Meats brand. Yeah, so it's here and there.
We might switch back to livestock. We've got a few more questions in that area. So do we have livestock buyers who potentially go through and decide who can supply into our program?
Yeah, we do. So Michelle, you're the manager of that supply chain team. And then we have Jake and Claire, who are supply chain coordinators that are managing all of those things. And typically speaking, as I sort of pointed out before, if we've got a new producer, there's some criteria. So the closer you are, the more likely we are to to want to work with you and sort of take in trial lambs. So if you call from 600 kilometres away and say you've got 150 lambs you want to sell us on a trial basis, will probably disappoint you. We're really targeting things within 100 or 200 kilometres, and we do sort of go as far as field as about 400 kilometres, but most of our effort and energy is spent as local as we can. And really there's probably a bit of a pre-screening. So if you call up with merinos, there'll be a question about the genetics that you're using to make sure they are modern meat merino that's, that can meet the turn-off requirements that we have, because there's all sorts of little things that we've learned about what makes a successful merino and what potentially makes an unsuccessful merino, and the same applies for other breeds. So if you came to us for shedders locally, there's a few questions that we'd ask that would probably lead us fairly quickly to a conclusion about the likelihood of that being successful in our breed.
Do we use MSA grading? So is GLQ5 Plus MSA graded?
No, it's not at the moment. We work hand in hand with the MSA team, and we have done for a while. So we've got a back end pilot going, which is grading MSA grading lambs through this plant. So Gundagai lambs are being graded, and I think if I was bullish, which I always am, I'd say it'll be kind of ready in 3 months. But the reality is it's probably 6 or 12 months away from being able to be, fully rolled out. Certainly, we require the lambs in our supply chain to be MSA eligible from an on-farm point of view, from a pathways. So a pathways compliance is important to us. And look, I hope we'll be the first plant that actually MSA grades lambs using our objective measurement technology, and I'm sure that'll become part of the supply chain in the future.
Yeah, great. A really fantastic one here. So how has your relationship changed with your producer suppliers since providing increased carcass feedback?
That's an interesting question, because we for those of you who aren't familiar with our business, we had about a 20-year period of exclusivity with a major Australian supermarket. So from a fee-for-service from 2000 effectively until 2020, we were a fee-for-service only, or a toll processing only plant. So we didn't buy livestock or sell meat for 20 years, from sort of 2000 to 2020. And because when we started again in 2020 and we established Gundagai Lamb, we were starting from scratch. We didn't really have to convert any farmers. We really just sort of said, hey, we've got this new thing we're going to start. This is how we're going to operate it. And the approach will be to pay on a value-based marketing grid, to apply a bonus when you achieve outcomes that are superior in our modelling and backed by the MSA consumer taste tests. And so we didn't really have to convert people. So it's a bit of a tough one to answer in terms of how has the relationship changed, because it's always been the way it is. I think what makes me the proudest about it is the producers that we have. And we've got a program called the Pioneers Program that we meet with regularly, but the conversations that our team has with producers, the excitement when they call up about something that's really worked, when they've sent a consignment, and then also the sort of unpicking we do with producers that they send a consignment and it doesn't quite go the way that they want. And I guess the level of intelligence and engagement from our producers in trying to kind of really get better excites me, because we do have a lot of producers in our supply chain that are highly engaged by the data, who are really trying to get better, and I imagine will be the backbone of our brand for the next, decade and beyond.
Yeah, great. And I guess off the back of that, someone has asked about growers who are driving their IMF and lean meat yield effectively, and if they're doing so, which you've just answered, yes, we've obviously got a lot of producers that are doing that.
Yeah.
But there's some questions around what are some of the management practices, or what tools do producers have available to them on farm to be able to achieve high IMF and GLQ 5+ scores?
So I think that there's obviously a bucket load of research that's been done, and sort of education packs that have been built by industry for industry. So I'd say MLA is one source of that. We run, the equivalent, I don't know if it's still called Profitable Grazing Systems, the PGS programs. Michelle, is that?
Yes. So the PGS is still available.
So there's those kind of engagement processes. I think there's ways that you can educate yourself around the sheep genetics website about how to select certain ASBBs and the importance of matching nutrition. But there are a lot of, I guess, people in, certainly we do it directly, and then there are other consultants that can help producers on farm balance those traits. And it is a balancing act. You can't kind of just go out and say, right, I'm going to have the highest IMF, because if you really lean into IMF, then you might have something that's got, low fertility, low growth, and ends up really fat and blows up your entire practice. So there's a gently kind of an approach to it. And I guess the one thing that producers have got going is that industry's processing sector has been really slow to take this up. So you've got a bit of time to move the boat, if you like, or turn the ship before, there's a wide requirement for these hurdles to be met.
Great. Just one I want to touch on, just around shear force. Obviously, you mentioned shear force in your presentation. Just around what's the reasoning that you haven't adopted testing for shear force sooner? And also, what percentage of the shear force data will you put on eating quality of that lamb?
Great question. We don't have a device that can measure shear force and chain speed is the first way to answer that question. So we don't have we don't have any way of measuring it. We're looking at measurement devices and whether we can, use a device at chain speed to predict shear force. We know that higher IMF lambs are more likely to have low shear force, but we also know that there are outliers where you could actually have a great IMF outcome, but a not so great shear force outcome. So it's one of those things on the list of things we'd love to be able to measure to really safeguard and bolster that eating quality assessment on plant. And if there's a device available, you can bet that we'll be trialling it on this plant.
All right, just a couple to finish off, I think. We're nearly at 2 o'clock. So do you foresee a day when a hogget is paid the same amount as lamb if it hits the right IMF or GLQ5 plus specs?
Oh, I'd love it. I think that'd be fantastic. A yearling lamb program would be really good. I think that's probably why we're looking at, is there a better objective measurement of maturity than the teeth-based system? So is there a way that we can measure a carcass, something like ossification, that'll give us a better steer on, I guess, exactly the maturity of the animal? I'm not sure hogget's ever going to be sexy from a marketing point of view. It's a terrible word in English to say, hogget. It doesn't sound very appealing. But a yearling lamb, I think, has lots of potential. I think probably there's still a lot to unpack and explore around what the consumer taste tests say about that product. But no doubt heaps of work will be done on that to create more value for the industry and flexibility, for sure.
Right. All right. And just to end, where can people buy GLQ5 plus meat from?
So I sort of went through a few of those examples. You can get it in Gundagai at the local butcher shop. Food service in Sydney and Melbourne, it's reasonably straightforward to buy. I think probably the best way is just to hit us up on socials. So just send us a message on Instagram or Facebook or whatever your preferred social network is. Tell us where you live and where you'd like to try it, and we'll be able to get some to you, or at least point you in the right direction.
Great. All right. We've had heaps of questions. There's some we haven't gotten to. If your name is attached to them, we'll do our best to actually get you an answer to that question after the webinar. Will the record, are we having the recording available to everyone for later?
Yeah, we'll pull it down and figure out how to publish it and where. It'll probably be something we'll put up on YouTube, I suggest. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Great. Thanks so much, Will. What a fantastic Q&A session.
Thanks, everybody.
Great questions. All right. Thanks, everybody.
See you.
Bye.